Crimea was supposed to be Russia's safe rear base, a fortress, a supply hub, a military bridge between Russian territory and the war in southern Ukraine. But that safe zone is now being hunted piece by piece. Ukraine is no longer looking only at the Kerch Bridge, the symbol Moscow wants the world to fear. The pressure is spreading across railways, road bridges, ferry crossings, fuel depots, power stations, supply trains, and military convoys moving between Mariupol, Melitopol, and Crimea. This is what makes the story dangerous for Russia. Ukraine may not need one dramatic strike to cut Crimea off. It can do something slower, quieter, and perhaps more damaging. It can make every Russian supply route harder to use, harder to protect, and easier to track. If fuel cannot reach tanks, if ammunition cannot reach artillery units, and if bridges or ferries stop for repairs, the front line begins to feel the damage before the map even changes. Before we go deeper, subscribe to the Military Force because Crimea may still be connected, but it may no longer be safe. Ukraine's campaign in Crimea is no longer just about hitting one famous bridge. It is now about weakening the whole system that keeps Russia's southern war machine alive. For years, Moscow treated Crimea as more than occupied territory. It was a rear base, a military platform, and a supply gate into southern Ukraine. From this peninsula, Russia could support troops near Kherson, Zaporizhia, and parts of Donetsk. Fuel could move forward. Ammunition could be stored. Aircraft and naval assets could operate from protected bases. Commanders could also use Crimea as a bridge between Russia's homeland and the battlefield. That is why the current pressure matters so much. Ukraine is not only attacking military hardware, it is attacking the place that helps that hardware keep fighting. The Kerch Bridge remains important, but it is no longer the only center of this story. After earlier attacks, Russia had to spread its supply routes across more roads, rail lines, ferry links, depots, and temporary crossings. That helped Moscow avoid depending on one single route, but it also created a wider target list for Ukraine. A supply system that is spread out can be harder to kill in one blow, but it is also harder to guard every hour of the day. Each new route needs air defense, electronic warfare, repair crews, fuel trucks, military police, and local security. That turns protection itself into a heavy burden. This is the logic behind Ukraine's broader campaign. Kyiv is not only trying to destroy fixed targets, it is trying to disturb the flow of war. A bridge can be repaired. A ferry can return to service. A rail line can be patched. But if all of them are placed under repeated threat, Russia has to move slower, plan more carefully, and expose more vehicles along the way. A fuel truck waiting near a crossing becomes visible. A train forced to delay its route becomes easier to track. A repair team working after a strike becomes another sign that the system is under pressure. In modern war, movement itself can become a target. A battle can be changed before tanks ever meet on open ground. Russia does not lose combat power only when a tank is destroyed by a missile or a drone. It also loses strength when that tank does not receive fuel on time, when artillery units wait for shells, or when spare parts cannot reach damaged vehicles. Logistics may look less dramatic than a tank battle, but it decides how long an army can keep attacking. Ukraine seems to understand this clearly, and that is why Crimea is being squeezed from the rear instead of challenged only at the front. This pressure has already changed the meaning of Crimea for Russia. The peninsula has not been fully cut off, and Moscow still has ways to move supplies. But the old idea of Crimea as a safe rear area is becoming much harder to defend. If a rear base needs more air defense, more jammers, more escorts, and more engineers just to keep supplies moving, then it is no longer operating like a normal rear base. It starts to function like a second front, where every road, bridge, and depot must be watched. That is what makes this campaign more serious than one damaged bridge or one burning fuel site. Ukraine is forcing Russia to protect a network that was built for movement, not constant defense. And once that network becomes exposed, The next question is not only where Ukraine will strike. The deeper question is which part of Russia's Crimea supply chain is already becoming too expensive to use. The strikes near Rozdolny and Vladislavivka show that Ukraine is now hunting Russia's rail logistics, not only its storage sites. The 413th Raid Regiment of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces reportedly hit 2 Russian locomotives in occupied Crimea. That may sound smaller than a bridge strike or a burning fuel depot, but for a railway army, locomotives are not minor targets. They are the engines that keep heavy military cargo moving. Without them, fuel tanks, ammunition wagons, spare parts, and equipment can sit still even when the rails remain on the map. This is why the attack matters. Ukraine is not only looking for what Russia stores, it is looking for how Russia moves it. The locations are also important. Rozdolny and Vladislavivka sit on the railway line, running from Jankoy toward Kirk and then toward the Crimean Bridge. This route helps connect the eastern side of the peninsula with the wider rail network that brings military supplies into Crimea. Jankoy has long been one of the key rail hubs in northern Crimea, while Kerch is tied to Russia's connection across the strait. When locomotives on this corridor are hit, the damage is not limited to 2 machines. It can disturb timing, force route changes, and create pressure at stations that were already carrying a heavy wartime load. Rail transport is especially valuable for Russia because it can move mass in a way trucks cannot. A train can carry large volumes of fuel, shells, vehicles, and engineering material with fewer drivers and less road exposure. That is why Russian logistics has always leaned heavily on railways. But that strength becomes a weakness when Ukrainian drones can reach the locomotives, bridges, junctions, and moving trains themselves. A truck convoy can scatter, a rail line cannot. A train must follow steel tracks, pass known stations, and move through predictable points. Once those points are watched, the advantage of mass movement begins to shrink. The transcript source you provided gives a useful picture of how this kind of strike can be turned into a long-range hunt. It describes FPV drones flying deep into Crimea, using relay links, following railway tracks, fighting through electronic interference, and looking for fuel or ammunition cars that could create larger damage if hit. Some of those technical details should be treated carefully unless confirmed by independent sources. But the tactical idea is powerful. A rail target is not just attacked at the final second. It can be tracked, studied, approached through weak spots in the defense network, and forced into a moment where one accurate drone matters more than many expensive systems. This is the deeper danger for Moscow. A depot can be hidden, hardened, or moved. A locomotive has to work in the open. It must pull cargo through fixed routes, and it often needs to operate on a schedule. If Ukraine can damage even a small number of these engines, Russia must either slow the flow of supplies, shift cargo to trucks, or spend more resources defending rail movement across Crimea. None of those choices is easy, and all of them add friction to the southern supply chain. So the strikes near Rozdolny and Vladislavivka were not only about 2 damaged locomotives. They were a message to Russia's railway system. The cargo is no longer the only target because the movement itself is now exposed. And once the rail corridor becomes dangerous, the pressure naturally spreads to the roads running beside it. Ukraine is now putting pressure on both Russia's rail corridor and its main road lifeline into Crimea. The Kerch-Jankoy Railway matters because it connects the eastern gate of Crimea with one of the peninsula's most important transport hubs. Kerch links back toward Russia through the strait, while Jankoy helps distribute cargo deeper into northern and western Crimea. That makes this rail line more than a local route. It is part of the structure that allows Russia to bring heavy cargo into the peninsula and then move it toward military zones that support the southern front. When drones hit bridges or rail points along this corridor, they are not just damaging steel and concrete, they are touching the timing system behind Russia's war effort. This is why the bridge strike near Rozdolny carries more weight than it may first appear. The bridge over the North Crimean Canal sits on a route tied to the Kerch-Jankoy line, and that means damage there can create pressure far beyond one crossing. Railways work best when trains can move on schedule, pass through known junctions, and deliver large loads without constant interruption. If a bridge is damaged, trains may have to slow down, stop, reroute, or wait for inspections. Even a temporary disruption can create a queue of cargo that was supposed to keep moving toward depots, bases, and later the front. But Russia cannot simply move everything from rail to road without creating another problem. The R-280, also known as the Novorossiya Highway, has become one of the most dangerous supply routes in occupied southern Ukraine. It links Russia's Rostov area with Mariupol, Melitopol, and Crimea along the Sea of Azov corridor. On paper, that road gives Moscow another way to keep supplies flowing when rail links are under pressure. In reality, Ukrainian drones have turned it into a hunting ground for fuel trucks, military convoys, and support vehicles. A route built for movement is now forcing drivers to think about exposure every mile. This is the trap Ukraine is building. Rail and road are supposed to support each other. If trains are delayed, trucks can carry urgent loads. If highway traffic becomes risky, rail can move heavier cargo with fewer vehicles. But when both systems are hit at the same time, Russia loses the comfort of a simple backup plan. Moving supplies by truck means more drivers, more fuel use, more escorts, and more chances for drones to spot movement. Moving supplies by train means fixed tracks, known bridges, and predictable stations. Each option still works, but neither looks safe anymore. The numbers show why this campaign matters. The Guardian reported that Ukraine's so-called middle strike campaign has focused on targets around 20 to 200 kilometers behind the front line, including roads, railways, and bridges. Ukrainian commander Robert Brovdy also said military cargo traffic on the R-280 had fallen by 71% in 2 weeks. Even if that figure comes from Ukraine and should be read carefully, the direction is clear. Kyiv is not only striking what sits at the front, it is reaching into the space where Russian logistics prepares, moves, and reorganizes before the next attack. For Russia, this does not mean supplies stop overnight. Armies adapt. They reroute trucks, repair bridges, use ferries, move at night, and place more air defense along key roads. But every adjustment adds cost. Longer routes burn more fuel. Smaller convoys carry less cargo. Heavy escorts reduce flexibility. Delays can lower artillery tempo and make it harder to rotate units on time. In a war of attrition, a supply system does not have to collapse to hurt the army it supports. It only has to become slower than the battlefield requires. That is why the Kerch-Jankoy line and the R-280 are now part of the same story. One is the rail artery, the other is the road lifeline, and Ukraine is trying to make both difficult to trust. Once those two routes come under pressure, Russia has to lean harder on the narrow gates into northern Crimea. Armyansk, Chonhar, and Henichesk are now the narrow gates Ukraine is trying to squeeze. These places matter because they connect Crimea with the occupied parts of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. They are not famous like the Kerch Bridge, but they carry the kind of traffic an army cannot live without. Fuel trucks, ammunition loads, repair vehicles, reinforcements, and engineering teams all need these corridors to move between the peninsula and the southern front. If Crimea is a large military warehouse, then these crossings are the doors. A warehouse can be full, but if the doors are damaged, every delivery becomes slower and more exposed. That is where Ukraine is applying pressure. In June, Ukrainian strikes were reported around Chonhar, Henichesk, Mirn, and Armyansk. This pattern matters more than any single blast. It shows that Kyiv is not trying to solve the Crimea problem by breaking one bridge and waiting for Russia to panic. Instead, Ukraine is hitting several northern entrances at almost the same time. That forces Russian commanders to make hard choices. They must decide which crossing gets air defense, which route receives engineers, which convoy moves first, and which supply load must wait. Once those choices pile up, the whole network begins to lose speed. The first separate assault regiment of Ukraine also said it struck areas around Armyansk, Henichesk, and Chonhar. These are not random map names. Open source reporting has described them as key bottlenecks between Crimea and the southern battlefield, with some bridges located roughly 50 to 75 miles from the front line. That distance is important. They are far enough to feel like the rear, but close enough for modern mid-range drones to reach. For Russia, that removes a layer of comfort. A truck does not have to be near a trench to be in danger anymore. The damage also creates a practical problem for heavy traffic. Reports and satellite imagery have pointed to cumulative damage near Chonhar, Armyansk, and Henichesk, with pontoon crossings appearing beside damaged routes. A pontoon can keep movement alive, but it is not the same as a permanent bridge. It is slower, more fragile, easier to watch, and more vulnerable to follow-up strikes. Heavy trucks may need to reduce speed. Convoys may have to wait in line. Drivers may be forced into predictable approach roads, and that predictability is exactly what drone teams look for. This is the quiet power of striking a bottleneck. Ukraine does not need to destroy every road in northern Crimea. It only needs to make the main passages unreliable. When one crossing is damaged, traffic shifts to another. When that route is hit, Russia builds a temporary fix. When vehicles gather around the temporary route, drones get more visible targets. The same cycle can repeat again and again. Repair work, fuel queues, pontoon traffic, and air defense activity all create signs that can be watched from above. A bridge can be repaired, but the repair process itself can reveal the next target. For Moscow, the military cost is bigger than concrete and asphalt. Every mobile air defense system sent to guard a crossing is one system not protecting a depot, a convoy, or a frontline position. Every engineer repairing a road is one more specialist working under drone threat. Every delay at Armyansk, Chonhar, or Henichesk can affect supplies moving towards Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. Russia can still adapt, but adaptation takes time and resources. That is why these northern gates matter. Once they become unstable, the pressure moves deeper into Crimea's daily logistics. The pressure on Crimea is now moving beyond military routes and into daily life on the peninsula. For Russia, this is a serious warning. A logistics campaign becomes more dangerous when it starts to affect fuel supply, public transport, railway schedules, and civilian movement. Russian-appointed authorities in Crimea have already restricted gasoline sales to the public and businesses, keeping available fuel for essential government and security services. Sevastopol has also seen sharp fuel price pressure. That does not mean Crimea is collapsing, but it does show that the supply squeeze is no longer hidden behind military fences. When ordinary drivers, local services, and transport operators begin to feel shortages, the war in the rear becomes much harder for Moscow to explain. The Kerch ferry system has also been pulled into the fight. British defense intelligence assessed that Ukrainian strikes on Crimea and the Kerch Strait area hit air defense systems, fuel storage sites, and 3 vehicle ferries. That matters because ferries became more important after earlier damage and restrictions around the Crimean bridge. Trucks that cannot move freely across the bridge need another way across the strait. If ferries are disabled, delayed, or forced to pause operations, the whole crossing system becomes more fragile. A bridge can carry a political message, but a ferry carries the practical weight of war. This puts fresh pressure on the Crimean bridge itself. The bridge is still one of Moscow's highest value targets to protect, but the wider Ukrainian campaign is making that job harder. If air defense near the Kerch area is being struck, if fuel depots are burning, and if ferries are damaged at the same time, Russia must defend many layers of the same crossing network. It cannot focus only on the bridge deck. It has to guard the approaches, the fuel system, the ferry terminals, the radar sites, and the roads feeding into the crossing. That is a much bigger defense problem. Russia is responding with more protection, but more protection also creates more pressure. Moscow can deploy mobile air defense, electronic warfare teams, smoke screens, patrol units, checkpoints, detours, and pontoon crossings. It can also tighten traffic control and move supplies at night. But there is a limit. Russia cannot place a Panzer, an S-400 battery, or a jammer beside every bridge, ferry, convoy, rail engine, and fuel truck. Each system moved to Crimea is a system that cannot be used somewhere else. The rear is demanding more of the same equipment the front line also needs. Ukraine's drone range is the reason this problem keeps growing. Open-source reporting describes a middle strike campaign reaching targets roughly 20 to 200 kilometers behind the front, while newer mid-range drones have been described in the 30 to 300 kilometer class. Some assessments suggest the threat envelope may approach or pass the 300-kilometer mark, so it is safer to say Ukraine is pushing deeper rather than claim one exact limit. The main point is clear. Crimea is not being attacked only at its edge. Its inner routes, depots, crossings, and support systems are now inside a wider UAV battle space. In the short term, Russia can still keep Crimea supplied through detours, smaller convoys, repair work, ferries, and tighter military control. But those fixes make the network longer, slower, and easier to observe. A convoy that avoids one bridge may expose itself on another road. A ferry delay can create a line of vehicles. A damaged depot forces fuel to move from farther away. This is how a logistics system weakens before it breaks. The political meaning is just as important as the military one. Crimea is not only a supply zone for Russia. It has been one of the central symbols of Vladimir Putin's power since 2014. Every fuel shortage, delayed train, damaged ferry, and threatened crossing raises a question Moscow does not want to face. If Russia cannot keep Crimea moving safely, can it still claim that the peninsula is secure? Ukraine's campaign in Crimea is not just a series of explosions. It is a slow-pressure campaign against the system that keeps Russia's southern war effort moving. Russia has not lost Crimea, and its supply routes have not disappeared. Moscow can repair bridges, redirect convoys, use ferries, deploy air defense, and strengthen electronic warfare. But every solution now carries a cost. A slower convoy means delayed fuel. A damaged crossing means fewer heavy trucks. A ferry shutdown means longer lines and weaker movement. In a war of attrition, those small delays can become battlefield pressure. The most realistic forecast is that Ukraine will keep trying to wear Crimea down, not cut it off in one dramatic strike. Kyiv can hit bridges, rail engines, fuel depots, ferries, and road convoys again and again, forcing Russia to repair, reroute, and defend under constant threat. Crimea may remain connected, but it is becoming more exposed, more expensive, and harder to protect. If you want clear battlefield analysis without the noise, subscribe to Military Force and stay with us for the next report.